Welcome to my talk about tables. Arguably the most boring possible subject matter in all of web development. So thank you for attending. It just happens that I have been building tables since they were first introduced by Netscape, which was prior to the turn of the century slash millennium, and all the way through decades of client projects, which means I have accumulated some opinions over the years. This opening slide shows a dining room with a table and chairs, a sideboard with lamp and books, and shelving with glassware and yet smaller shelves. The the gag here being it's a talk about tables, and my pictures are tables. Wait, I didn't explain that well. Tables that normal humans sit at, not for data. Rousing start, me. Um, Okay, there we go. I'm going to start this talk with the basics of tables, though. The image here is a plain pine table with some fabric swatches and a notepad and a basket of stuff. Nothing fancy, just about as basic as a table gets. Now, tables have a specific purpose. They represent data across two axes so that a reader can understand the relationship between those chunks of data. Tables use columns and rows to do this. Visually and programmatically, they provide at-a-glance insights, ideally. If you're using them for key value pairs, you might be using them for the wrong purpose. Generally, a clue you're doing this is when your table has only two rows or two columns. Definitely don't use tables for layout. The last century called and thinks you misunderstood all its warnings, so stop. Note to self, insert appropriate caveats about HTML email. Avoid the shouts at clouds call to return to plain text email that I usually do in a talk. Okay, so this talk only cares about HTML tables. I may mention ARIA table roles in passing simply because of bugs and gaps and ways that might be able to help you. This talk also does not discuss ARIA grid roles. Those are mostly tables with an inflated ego, though most of the structural concepts that I will be discussing throughout this talk still apply to them. A simple table is structurally straightforward. Ideally, it gets a caption. HTML has a caption element, so please use it. It functions well, and it provides context for all users. You could use ARIA instead of the caption if you hate HTML. Using ARIA labeled by to point to visible text still lets a user see and select it. Using ARIA label, however, hides the text from most users, can't be selected, and is unlikely to auto-translate. It is not a WCAG conformance requirement to provide an accessible name for a table. This seems to come up on the semi-regular. A simple table uses column headers and/or row headers. This makes that two-dimensional relationship between the data far easier for users to track as they go. Try to stick with no more than one set of each. Do not leave column or row headers blank. A simple table probably doesn't need a scope attribute. The scope attribute identifies if a header cell is a row or column header. The browser, however, is pretty good at figuring this out, just like most of your readers might be. If the header cell is in the first row, then it's probably a column header. If it's the first cell in a row, it's probably a row header. The only time you may need to set a scope attribute is in the very first cell of the table, where it could either be the row header for all the column headers or the column header for all the row headers. And yes, I understand it's confusing to talk about a row header for column headers and a column header for row headers. Even I did that hand gesture completely wrong. You can add a T-head, T-foot, T-body, and cal group elements if you want, but generally they don't impact how the table content is exposed. If you forget them, then for a simple table, it likely won't have any impact. A simple table does not span any rows or columns, as in every cell belongs to one and only one row and column at a time. Put your row headers in the first column and your column headers in the first row. Don't put your column or row headers mid-table. They are often only recognized for cells that follow them in the DOM, literally in the source code. Don't assign new column or row headers partway into the table. Generally, they are additive with prior headers, which gets rather complex and a bit verbose. Don't put your column headers at the end of the table, whether or not you stuff them in a T-head. And don't put your column headers in a T-foot, no matter where you put them in the table. I hate that these are common enough mistakes that I have to dedicate a slide to them, but here we are. Before I move to the next slide, I should also note that the ABBR attribute or abbreviation attribute, not the element, has no practical support anywhere. So pretend it doesn't support, and yes, I have filed bugs. Now, a complex table, similar but different. It also benefits from a caption. It also gets column and or row headers. Those row and column headers still probably don't need a scope attribute. Use T-head, T-foot, T-body, and col group as you would for a simple table, which means maybe not at all. But here's where a complex table differs. At least one cell, which could potentially be a header cell, spans more than one row and or column. At that point, since a spanning cell could be associated with more than one header cell, you need to provide some guidance to the browser on which one to use. The headers attribute kind of does this. It associates spanning cells with a header or more than one header. What you do is you provide a space-separated list of ID references pointing to the header or headers that you want to associate, and the browser is supposed to expose those in the order provided. Sadly, tables with spanning cells don't work out in real life, or IRL, as the kids say. The headers attribute is largely ignored. Adding T-head, T-body, T-foot, and col group have no impact in my testing, but you should always test on your own. Sort of a recurring theme here. Adding col group and row group values to the scope attribute has no effect either. Whenever you span a data cell, there is a reasonable chance it will be assigned the wrong header. Whenever you span a header cell, there is a reasonable chance the cells to which it is assigned via the headers attribute won't have it exposed. Typically, the browser and screen reader will choose the first header cell that a cell spans, which means you need to test the proverbial poop out of any cell spans. In some cases, JAWS will announce the header as many times as the cell spans. So if a cell spans 3 headers, JAWS may announce its header 3 times. Kind of annoying. VoiceOver may simply decline to announce any headers. It also may not let a user navigate all cells in a table, kicking the user to a new column after encounters a spanning cell in a prior column. If it's any consolation, ARIA does not help. There is no ARIA version of the headers attribute. Other ARIA, such as ARIA labeled by, will override the cell data, so that's right out. ARIA described by is also ineffective in this context. While visually, the structure might be clear to users, for those who use screen readers or maybe use some automation to test it or parse it, there are plenty of challenges. The simplest advice I have is simply to not span cells ever of any kind, if you can avoid it. If you have no choice and you cannot fire your boss, client, vendor, whatever, then you, again, have to test the heck out of it across all the browser and screen reader combinations that you can muster. This table of books has multiple rows of column headers. It has an ISBN column header that spans ISBN 10 and ISBN 13 headers. It also has a formats column, specific media formats, that spans column headers each for paper, audio, and digital. And then for extra chaos, it has multiple columns of row headers, because I'm mean. One set of row headers reflects global regions, and the row headers for authors span those global regions. For example, there are 3 authors in the Europe region, and 1 author spans both North America and Africa. Now, every screen reader and browser combination that I tested had variations on announcing the wrong headers and also breaking table navigation. So, as always, test. Also, probably don't do this. Now, let's say you have figured out how to get your spanning cells to work across all possible platforms in use by your users, which is an impressive feat, I might add. You must be certain that the number of cells per column is the same across every column, and the number of cells per row is the same across every row. The span count of spanning cells contributes to this. I hate that there are so many word overlaps involved in this talk, and I'm never talking about the span element. I just want to be clear about that. So the span count of spanning cells contributes to the number of cells per row. So a cell that spans 3 columns is counted as 3 toward the total count. If the count is off, then your column and row header associations will also be off. Table navigation will also be a problem for users. Visually, this can be hard to spot in some tables, and the browser inspector is not always clear on this. So be certain to count any spans and also test header announcements with a screen reader. Now I'm going to cover responsive tables, pivoting subjects here. Specifically, I'm going to cover two flavors of responsive tables. The image in this slide is a table, specifically a gate leg table. One half of the table is already folded up with a couple chairs under it, and the other half is still folded down against the central pillar of the table. I'm going for visual puns here. Like all my puns, they're terrible. Now, the simplest under-engineered method to make a responsive table doesn't affect the table code at all. You wrap the table in a generic container element, and then you add two styles. No JavaScript is needed. In fact, if JavaScript is involved, call your physician. If you are forced to make a complex table, like I had talked about in previous slides, one with spanning cells, this approach will preserve that effort. Code sample here, I use a div element. It's already treated as block in CSS. It's generic. Since the container is going to let the user scroll the table, it needs to be keyboard focusable. Granted, if the nested table has focusable descendants, then link, button, checkbox, the keyboard user can already get into that container and scroll it. However, if not, as of this talk, neither Safari nor Chrome will let a keyboard user put focus on that scrolling container. Firefox does. Kudos to Firefox. Chrome has been working on matching Firefox for a year now. It might finally land in Chrome 130. It's rolled out a couple times and been rolled back. There is no signal from Safari that they plan to support this. Anyway, that means you need to give it a tab index attribute, which will satisfy WCAG SC211 keyboard. But once it can be focused, it needs an appropriate role and accessible name to satisfy SC412 name, role, and value. I use the region role since it's a generic landmark, and for the accessible name, I reference the caption. Now I make a CSS selector that sets the wrapper to overflow, which allows that scrolling effect. That's how we satisfy SC1410 reflow. My CSS selector looks for the region role, ARIA labeled by, and the tab index. And by using all three, I'm ensuring the table won't scroll unless it is marked up to support the other WCAG success criteria and works for keyboard users without creating a confusing tab stop for screen reader users. This also makes it easier to spot when developing it as well, because if you forget one of those, table won't scroll. I also make a focus version of that selector. So this satisfies SC247 focus visible, but also lets the user know where the focus landed. And then to meet SC1411 non-text contrast, choose a color with a 3:1 contrast ratio against whatever the content background is. Use the outline property to ensure that it will be visible in Windows high contrast mode, contrast themes, force colors mode, etc. You probably don't want to set a force color style since Windows maps a system color automatically already. Motion warning. On the next slide, I have some video that bounces around a bit. So back in 2002, Leah Veru created styles for vertical scrolling shadows. Chen Weijing adapted them for horizontal use in 2018. And for browsers that hide scroll bars by default, these can be used as a visual cue that content is hidden. If you use these for non-right to left languages, you may want to swap them or add a language or direction selector to handle that swap automatically. Although it wouldn't be automatic because you coded it. You may have noticed that the shadows in this video, I'm pointing to a screen you can't see, this is weird. The shadows are very subtle, subtle enough that the video compression might have eaten them, just like the swish of each scrolling left and right. Now, for the over-engineered method, because I mentioned there were two methods, you are right to reach for CSS display properties, but I go for display block before I go for flex or grid when I start to restructure the table. One question that you really need to answer up front is if you plan to remove the column headers. You probably want to at least visually hide them, but you may need to replicate them within the individual cells depending on the amount and complexity of the data. If you have a trained audience, it might not matter so much they expect it, or they expect it to be quiet. So the challenge here is how verbose your replicated column header content will be for screen reader users. An additional challenge is that you cannot simply replicate those column headers using CSS. If you use CSS generated content, that means peppering the column headers, perhaps in data attributes. Those won't auto-translate. This is a case where you might need JavaScript for the technique that you plan to use. This approach can work with tables that have spanning cells, but it's going to require some extra effort on your part for it to work and be clear to users. Overall, I'm not providing a single pile of guidance here because there are too many factors. I think Kevin Powell has a video with a more compelling take on this. He based it on my 2017 effort, but his is more current and up to date, so probably explore that. Now, owing to older browser bugs, you might also need to add duplicative ARIA rules for each row, cell, and header cell. Now, while Safari was the last one to fix these bugs in October of 2023, that's recent enough that you might still need to add those roles. That's a decision you'll have to make on your own. Oh, and if your cells have long content that may not wrap very well, even after you reflow them, you should probably still use the under-engineered approach in addition to what I outline here. So still wrap it in a wrapping container, a scrolling container rather. But I implore you, whatever you do, reset this to a standard table layout, at least for your print styles, because you have print styles, right? I mean, yeah, good answer. Okay, so fair warning, there's also some movement on the next slide. This video shows me adjusting the width of my example table, screeching all the way in pain, I think. At the 7-second mark, the reflow kicks in as it pops the new layout into place. Grinding noises continue as I scale it down. You can see that I've replicated the column header into each cell, but I did it as CSS generated content, and I still feel bad about that. But I built this in 2017, and for context, Justin Bieber and Coldplay were in the top 10. We all did weird stuff in the before times, so yeah. Okay, moving on now to fixed headers, specifically fixed table headers. Sometimes a table is too large to fit in anyone's viewport, no matter how tall or how wide. In those scenarios, you might want to keep the row and or column headers visible. The image I'm using for this section introduction isn't so much a table as it's a wall shelf with a couple drawers that can't be moved. And below it are a series of hooks. One of them is holding a red coat and another is holding a drawstring bag. And there's some other loose stuff lying about. So fixed table headers, the good news is that this approach requires no extra ARIA and no JavaScript. But you're going to lean on elements and attributes that you might recall a few slides ago I said you could ignore. Because why not? Even though they don't do much for users, they are actually really good style hooks. Using scope equals row on your row headers makes it easier to make a CSS selector. Sure, you could also do a first child or nth child and ignore the scope attribute completely if you want. Position sticky on this ensures that the cell stays put instead of scrolling out of the viewport. Left 0 makes it anchored to the left side, but that's only useful for left to right languages. Instead, I use the logical property inset inline start. That way, however the user is coming in whatever language, the table should just adapt. Z-index 1 sets it above the content of the table. If you are already using Z-index, you might need to just choose a different value, one that won't conflict. You may want to add a border to indicate the edge of the header cell when it has scrolled, but the CSS border property won't work because it gets hidden, just disappears. So while I used to rely on a background gradient, there is no logical property for the starting position of a gradient. I had to replicate the gradient across language directions, and that was a bummer. Now I use CSS generated content with logical property positioning, and I give that a border instead of a background color, so it's more likely to automatically pick up system colors in a forced colors context. Lots of words. Here I am showing some left-right scrolling in a table. The row headers stay put, and the rest of the content slides back and forth underneath it. For fixed column headers, you can use the t-head element here as your sticky element. If your element has no t-head, you can still use th. You don't even need to add a scope attribute since the row header selector that I covered a couple of slides ago already has it, making that one more specific. For this one, you can use top 0. but that won't do so well for non-horizontal languages. So the style I use instead is inset block start 0. Set the z-index to, adjust as appropriate based on what other z-indices you have on the page. And then this slide I covered after the row headers slide because the higher z-index ensures that it lives above any rows. Otherwise, you're going to get some weird and unexpected overlaps. This video shows me doing some up-down scrolling, and you can see that even though the caption scrolls out of view, the headers don't. The column headers stay put. Now, you can combine these techniques. The risk is that you have too much space taken up with fixed row headers and fixed column headers for users to actually see the remaining content. So you might need to set some max widths on the header cells. Those max widths can be a combination of viewport units, Ms, max content, min content, other relative units, whatever works. But be mindful of how they will wrap when the user scales the text or increases letter or word spacing. In other words, maybe consider whether either axis of headers needs to be sticky. It might be overkill. Being cautious would also include testing for conformance with WCAG success criterion 144 resize text, as well as 1412 text spacing. So I have a video here that demonstrates a table that is too large for the viewport and has fixed headers on both axes. This can be incredibly useful, or it can be incredibly frustrating. So be thoughtful of how you implement this at all, and definitely test with your users. Now, there is a challenge with scroll snap and tables because often users will want to compare data across cells, whether it's across rows or across columns. If you have small chunks of data, it might not be a big deal. But if the cells contain a sizable amount of data, then scroll snap can cause the content to be partially hidden by your fixed headers. This also makes it easier to fail 2411 focus not obscured minimum in case those cells have any interactive controls. I have a video here that demonstrates me scrolling up and down in a table with scroll snap. The fixed headers end up hiding the first line of text of each cell. This also makes it particularly difficult to select text from the cell when some of it is hidden, as I'm trying to do there at about that 4-second mark. Since it's partially obscured by the fixed header, when I use my mouse to select past was visible, I end up getting content selected from all the other cells. So now I have to do a weird mouse dance to scroll it the other way without releasing in order to deselect the extra stuff. That's a hassle. In this video, I'm demonstrating a mistakes that with scroll snap that you can spot pretty quickly. In this case, the book author is taking up too much space, so a keyboard user can never see the book title. If I've scaled the text or word spacing, though, now I have a bigger problem because now I can no longer compare the ISBN numbers across columns. They are being consistently clipped as a keyboard user. I can't get them side by each. Okay, pivoting over to the labeling section. Tables with checkboxes or radios that let you choose a row are common. Same with tables that have text fields or buttons. And for the most part, labeling these controls is easy. This opening image is a photo of a basic shelving unit that has some boxes on it. Each box has a paper tag on it with a handwritten label. I did not zoom in enough to see whose names they are. I leave that to somebody else. So labeling controls. The label element works in a table and still provides a larger hit area. Buttons are self-labeling, so those are pretty straightforward. Column and row headers give context for the user, but sometimes a screen reader user in particular is moving through the fields only, tabbing down all the buttons or all the checkboxes. Now the column and row header content is not exposed. Worse, even if it was, it might not be sufficiently unique to identify which row is being affected. Now, using ARIA labeled by allows you to associate controls with the header, with both headers, with the control itself, and maybe with more information, because you can build a compound accessible name from multiple ID references. But just be smart in what order you string them together. Don't use ARIA label unless you want a 253 label in name risk and a guaranteed failure to auto-translate. And visually hidden text that lives in the table is almost definitely too verbose for regular table use, just navigating the content of a table. Here I have a table of books again. The checkbox comes before the author row header, so it already needs more context. The label element does what we want here. If you absolutely have to convey the column header for those checkboxes, which is flag, in that accessible name, then use ARIA labeled by to point to the column and row headers, both of them together. There's a text box in the second last column, and it uses ARIA labeled by to combine the row header, which is the book author, and the column header, which is claimed by. So a user might hear Mary Shelley claimed by input type of text. The last column has a remove button, and that button also gets an ARIA labeled by pointing to the author and itself, in which case its accessible name would be button. I'm sorry, it's the way it's announced would be button remove George Orwell. Yes, I have a demo on my site. You can play around with this and try for yourself how it's announced across screen readers. Taking a drink before this next session. I think I'm okay on time. That's alarming. There's mental panic that I somehow dropped 20 slides. I assure you I didn't, even though I'm still going to panic about it. Okay. Talking about selecting rows now. So a nice thing about using the label element is it gives users a larger hit area, but it's also not uncommon for authors to want an entire row to be clickable as an even larger hit area. So for this section, I'm going to discuss selecting stuff in tables. The photo here shows 4 wall-mounted cube shelves. One of those shelves is significantly higher than the others, almost like it's shouting, "Pick me, pick me." Now, the most common way I have seen authors create selectable rows is to put click handlers on the rows themselves. Unfortunately, this means many screen reader users hear clickable for every cell in the table, which is incredibly annoying and is the source of many, many bugs I have had to deal with over the years. It also makes it easy to forget to provide a control for keyboard users because you put your click handler on the row. And if you're only testing with a mouse, yeah, don't do that. Another method that I see more and more often rather, are authors assigning ARIA grid roles to make an entire row clickable. Unfortunately, ARIA grid roles require the author to do a lot of extra work for them to function properly for screen reader users. If the author uses divs with ARIA grid roles, then I can confidently say that they built it incorrectly. And I'm saying it confidently because I have not encountered a working one yet. Instead, CSS can go a long way here. So my approach means you cannot select the text, but I suggest you take a look at the BlockLink model that Hayden Pickering wrote about a while back, uses some JavaScript to get around that lack of selection. But essentially what you're doing here is taking your favorite BlockLink styles and adapting them to a table. The row header gets position relative. The label element gets CSS generated content that then expands to fill the row. Add focus and hover styles for backgrounds and or outlines. The only catch here is that you need to specify a width for the entire row to be clickable. Specifically for Safari, it needs the width to work at all. It's an old bug. It's a known bug. You could use script, or you could base it on viewport or content or whatever works for your users to define that width. I don't know the status of the Safari bug as of late. I haven't checked in a little while. In this table, I can select multiple rows of books. It's easier to click the book title cell than the checkbox because it's just bigger. But I can also click anywhere on the row to toggle one of the checkboxes. The image shows that table with a vague yellow background and a vague yet alarmingly thick blue border as a focus and hover visual cue. So whether you're using your mouse or your keyboard, you can see where the focus is, ideally at any time. Okay, we're going to move on now to discuss expando tables. I have worked with a lot of clients over the years who use tables where individual rows hide yet more rows. I think it's weird, but there's a use case for it. The image for this section intro is a black table that has no legs. It's mounted to a wall and folded down against the wall. There's a hinge visible, which allows the table to fold up and I guess do table things like hold stuff. Although I suppose if you take that leg when somebody has a mug of coffee on it and they're not looking, you kick it out of the way. It's actually sort of a prank table. Okay, so Expando basics. First, you need a bunch of hidden rows, and those hidden rows should match the rest of the table structure. And when I say that, I mean specifically the columns. Each of those rows would get the hidden attribute, makes it a lot easier. Then you'll need a disclosure widget. That disclosure widget, the trigger is the part that you're interested in, and that's a button with ARIA expanded. You can add ARIA controls and point to every row that will be displayed. That isn't exposed to the user at all, so meh. Now that disclosure widget trigger would remove the hidden attribute from the rows you want to show. So when the user hits it, removes it. So collapsing the rows is as simple then as adding the hidden attribute when the user hits that trigger again. It may be necessary to create an accessible name that manages the user's expectations for what will happen. For example, you might want to say how many more rows will appear. This seems like a courteous thing to do if you're going to throw 1,000 more rows at them. The HTML code that I have here shows an ARIA label for the button, which I'm only using here for ease of explanation, just easier to show it off. The button also has ARIA labeled by that refers to itself and the row header. The row header is the author's name. So in this case, the ARIA label is 3 more from. The column header is Mary Shelley. Combine those, the compound accessible name is 3 more from Mary Shelley, and it would announce as button. So now at least you've taken some steps to manage the user's expectations. Now, this video shows a row for Emma Dorothy Eliza Nevitt Southworth. I should have used a different author, and her book, The Hidden Hand. There's a disclosure button at the start of the row, and activating it reveals 3 more rows, each a book by Emma. Now, you can use this to expand more types of content than strictly rows that match the table structure. It's allowed, but if you do this, the row or the rows that you use should probably span the width of the table, and the content within shouldn't be too verbose or rich. And I'm suggesting you span the width of the table because you're no longer keeping the user in the context of navigating the columns and rows of the data. You're now putting them into new content. So I've built nested tables into these spanning rows, which has been a common request. And while it's accessible to screen readers, they generally did not like it, with the exception of users who expected it and were trained on it. Also, remember all my cautions earlier about spanning cells and assigning headers from earlier in this talk. Also, JAWS had a bug with nested tables that they only fixed as of January 2024. So be cautious and test. Broadly, I encourage you to maybe not have Expando rows with content or structure that does not match the surrounding table. Risky at best. Okay, we're going to talk about sorting our tables now. This is the final section of my talk. I'm doing alarmingly great on time. This is also the section of my talk that has one video with audio in it, so not at all stressful for me. But I want to manage expectations here. I'm not talking about sorting the data. I'm only talking about the controls for sorting. Now, the photo in my section intro here is a shelving unit that has 9 green plastic bins sort of shoved in these guides across 3 rows. And each plastic bin can slide out completely from the shelving unit and hold whatever you want, which I'd like to think those are waterproof for reasons that are irrelevant for the scope of this talk. Okay. Sortable columns. To clarify things here, I'm only going to speak about sortable table columns. Whether or not table rows should allow sorting is actually beyond my human capacity for reasoning. If you figure it out, let me know. For ease of styling the cells in the sorted column, we're going to lean on col group and col elements. Those can prove handy. The heavy lift of the sorting is performed by JavaScript, though for this talk, I'm only focusing on using JavaScript to manipulate ARIA values. If you want to find a script that sorts the data, you're on your own. You probably already have it in whatever is your preferred library, framework, whatever. In this case, the ARIA sort property does all the work for us, so we can use it as a styling hook as well. A button in the column header is what we're going to use to trigger the sort, and I use SVG images for the visual sort indicators, partly because they scale nicely and they're incredibly small. Now, because this is an only an hour talk, I'm going to breeze through this at a high level. See if I can pull it off. So the ARIA sort property goes on the TH. It has 4 values. None is the default value, means nothing is sorted. Now the ARIA spec says if you're using none, you should just remove the attribute completely. Cool. I may have opinions on that. No time for it now. The ascending value means the content has been sorted ascending, and descending means descending. There are people who don't know the difference. I am one of them. Yeah. I suggest that you pretend that the other value does not exist. Now, currently in ARIA, only one column can be sorted or should be sorted at a time, though there is some work ongoing to remove that restriction. For what I'm doing here, I am cycling between descending and ascending with every click of the sorting button, and I only remove ARIA sort from a column header when I sort another column. Some CSS here. I like to style the background color of the column that has sorted. You could brute force this by adding a class to every cell in the column. That's just wasteful. The col element allows you to use CSS to set the background color of every cell in the column instead. You could use JavaScript to set the currently sorted column number in a col nth child selector, but with support for has in all modern browsers, you can skip the JavaScript and write some slightly redundant CSS instead. In this case, I'm using CSS to select the col element in the position of the sorted column header, thanks to using has on the col group. I'm not going to read it all off. Unfortunately, you need to have as many of these selectors as you have columns. It's not ideal, but the column selector in CSS has no support. In this image, I demonstrate the column that has been sorted has a light yellow background, so it stands out ideally from the rest of the cells visually. You can, of course, use other styles and colors as appropriate. Now, the button is the only element in the column header, and the button's accessible name is also the column header. So you want to be as brief as possible, but distinct enough for a voice user to be able to select it. That means no hidden text if you can help it, because we're honoring 253 label and name. I use SVG, as I mentioned before, for the sort icons. Add ARIA hidden true to the SVGs to ensure they are not exposed, and added to the accessible name / column header. The sort icons are an up chevron and a down chevron, and when sorted, one of those becomes a filled triangle to indicate the sort direction. The advantage here is the visual cue does not rely simply on a color change, which is good for SC141 use of color. It also means it's far easier to support forced colors mode, Windows high contrast mode, contrast themes, however you refer to it. For the layout of the sort button, I use CSS grid template areas to lay out the SVGs alongside the button's text. I use min-max 2M comma max content on the grid area for the text label, and I do this so the text does not take up half the width of the available space. That would otherwise push the arrows to midway along the width of the button, which is weird and inconsistent. The padding inline to end logical property accounts for right to left languages for me here. In this CSS, the icons were scaled at 0.65 m, and then there is a width for the third column to take up all the remaining space. And I use empty CSS generated content to be that third column, and that's what fills the gap. When activating a sort button, by default, not all screen readers tell the user that anything has happened. NVDA used to be the only one. I'm sorry, JAWS used to be the only one. Wow. But now NVDA, JAWS, Narrator, and VoiceOver on iPad OS, I didn't test iOS, will announce immediately that a thing has sorted and how it's sorted. And of course, in a nod to cross-platform consistency, VoiceOver on Mac OS says nothing. The consistency being the joke there. Anyway, TalkBack also fails to announce that anything is sorted. That means you may need to add a live region to announce to the user when sorting has happened. My demo allows you to set the live region to polite, assertive, or just turn it off. I recommend building your live region support and being prepared to turn it off. If you know that nobody will ever visit on a Mac or on an Android phone, then you can probably skip it. If you don't have access to the full suite of browsers and screen readers for testing, I have a weird tool that might help. It's sort of a Mad Libs for how to assemble a sortable column header name. You provide the information, such as the type of control, should be a button, but I've seen people use link reasons, the number of columns, the sort state, the name, and more. And it builds two things for you. One, it builds the HTML that you would write. And two, it shows, or it tries to show, how various screen readers would announce it when they encounter it. It's from 2020, so some of it may have changed. I haven't updated it, but the concepts are still the same. Adapt it as you see fit. If you go to the page, which is linked from the blog post I'll be sharing later, you can scroll down and see all of the chaos of all of the output and figure out pretty quickly how it works. So I'm going to wrap up this section by backing up a little bit. ARIA, specifically the ARIA says, and I quote, authors should apply ARIA sort to only one header at a time, end quote. But there are use cases for more than one column to be sorted at a time, and ARIA does not explicitly forbid it. Now, the approach I'm outlining here is a suggestion, and I have a post going into far more detail on it. Broadly, you need to do this work all in the same control, same button, and without adding more noise to the page. I rely on live regions and data attributes, but do not change the accessible name of the button nor the column header. I'm going to play the video after I'm done explaining it here. This video is longer. Great time to do a bathroom break if you want one. Anyway, this video shows a prototype in use with a visible live region, and this is linked from the post I'll be sharing. The first time that you choose a column header, it sorts descending, and it makes that one the first priority. The second time you choose that same column header, it then makes it sort ascending and makes it the first priority in case it was not already. The third time you choose that same column header, it removes sorting for that column and sets the column that was second in priority to be first, adjusting others down the line. I don't know if this is the right way to do it. You may have opinions. It's difficult to explain just with words, which is what the video will do. I also have a blog post where you can leave comments. This is something I'm hoping to tackle for the ARIA working group, so your feedback is critical to getting it right, and so I can blame other people. Anyway, in this video, I use the tab key to demonstrate the column position is still announced, even though I am not using table navigation commands. So I'm just using the tab key. I use visible numbers on the column headers to show their sort priority, and I also identify every sorted column and its priority in a live region, which means this can get really verbose. Now, this video shows it in action as I sort by each of the first three columns and then go back to remove sorting for the first column.
Row 1, column 1, author button. Sorted down, sorted descending. Column 2, title button. Sorted down, author descending priority 2, sorted descending. Column 3, year button. Sorted down, author descending priority 3, title descending priority 2, sorted descending. Column 2, sorted descending title button. Column 1, sorted descending author button. Sorted up, title descending priority 3, year descending priority 2, sorted ascending. Sorting removed, title descending priority 2, year descending priority 1, not sorted.
So, lengthy video. I appreciate you staying awake through it. But like I said, it's a little hard to describe unless you're seeing it in action. So, leave some feedback. It would be unfair of me to not ask for audience input on these things. Of course, if you do go down this path on your own, whatever technique you eventually develop, make sure it adapts as much as possible to user preferences. The example image I have here, the table headers with the sort priority, those little numbers I talked about, as seen in Windows High Contrast mode, contrast themes in Windows 11. It also shows the sort buttons in high contrast mode, so you can see that visually they are still clear and distinct. Because after all, if you're building a new pattern, it's no good if that pattern doesn't work. And if it doesn't work for everybody, well, it just doesn't work. So that's it. That's my talk. This closing image shows a small table against a shallow wall shelf unit, along with a rolly cart used as a mobile table, I guess. I don't know. They have a lot of chairs. This picture has 6 chairs for a table that can hold maximum 3 people. So something is wrong here. I'm going to stop riffing on that. You can find links to the posts I've referenced on my site. Scan the QR code, which is taking up ideally most of your screen right now, or go to, I'm going to spell it out, rosel.li/webaim2024. To repeat that, it's rosel.li/webaim2024. I'm panic checking my site to make sure, yep, the post is live. You can also post corrections to my talk in the comments there, or praise, or I suppose coffee drink recipes, really whatever works. But thanks for staying. I hope you enjoy the remainder of the talks today. And I think this is the part where we do Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, that was wonderful. I appreciate the visuals. I'm glad your presentation was not on the body element. That maybe should have been a little interesting with the visuals,
That would
but
be mean
no.
and funny.
We had a couple of questions, just I think from folks that are maybe not developers and
Yeah.
maybe we're struggling a bit with some of those foundational principles. And maybe could take just a minute and just speak a little bit more about the caption element.
Sure.
And also kind of row and column scopes and maybe how they work in a table. Or you could point them to a resource if you'd like to.
Broadly, I'm going to cover these sort of broadly. And I understand this was a technical talk. And for those of you who are not technical, I'm sorry. For those of you who were technical, also, I'm sorry. The caption element is basically the visual label and the accessible name for the table. So you don't need it, but it's really nice to let the reader know what the table is, what it's about. You want to be brief. There are scenarios where you can use the caption element to include some context. And I talk about it in one of my posts that, hey, this table is going to sort if you do things to it, or what that sorting might do. So there's additional value to having it in some context, but broadly, good visual, good for screen reader users, good example of managing expectations. And what was the attribute that you were asking?
It was the caption and then just the kind of the scope attribute with row and column headers.
So the way the scope attribute is supposed to work is if you have a th on its own, a th is a header, but you don't know if it's a row or column header just on its own. A scope attribute, you can tell it, hey, I'm a row header or I'm a column header. The reason that I say that it's generally not necessary is because in practice, the table structure itself is clear enough that screen readers and browsers on their own just understand where they live. And visually is usually pretty clear as well. I hope that answers the question, but that was also vaguely technical.
Yep, no, I think that's wonderful. I believe that you mentioned that there were some problems with adding th in tfoot, and the question was just what are those problems if you put a table header in the footer of a table?
Well, a footer is the end of the table, so the column header just isn't exposed. I think visually it gets stuffed to the bottom of the table in all current browsers, which is hilarious. But also, as you're navigating the table with a screen reader, you will not hear what the column header is because as far as the browser is concerned, it's not a column header, it's just some ancillary related data.
Okay, great, thank you. You also mentioned that tables may not be optimal for key value pairs. So the question is, how do you recommend displaying key value pairs? My team has had an internal debate about whether description lists, the DL element, is appropriate for this.
So what I love about that question is I think that question will happen until the heat death of the universe. And that's primarily because it comes down to what's the context. Sometimes a regular list is good enough, just a UL or even an OL if you're anal retentive about in what order they appear. Description list / definition list / dictionary list, depending on which version of HTML you grew up on, is a fine choice. In fact, I tend to prefer it. and it allows you to have a key multiple values. The problem with it, though, is the exposure to screen reader users is not the same across screen readers, which many authors think is a problem. Many users might think it's a problem as well, but you should find out from your users. But I think a DL is fine as long as you accept that different screen readers will announce it in different ways and announce the counts in different ways. If that's a showstopper, avoid them. Probably just use a regular list.
Thank you. There were two questions about keyboard accessibility with tables. The first, are both grids and tables a single tab stop on the web page?
No, a table is just content. That's it. It's content with structural relationships. A grid is supposed to be a single tab stop. Specifically, it's a compound widget or a complex widget, which means that as soon as it takes focus, and it should take focus, you would then use the arrow keys to navigate within the ARIA grid. The catch there is now you, as the author, have to do a crap ton of scripting work in order to make that happen, which also can potentially blow up responsive expectations and so on, if you reflow the table. The benefit to that is usually pretty minimal. My experience in working with users and conducting tests is that when they hear a grid, often they're like, oh crap, now I need to learn how this particular grid works because it might not behave as the previous grid that I encountered, or broken grids or whatever. And typically they just want to fall back to table navigation. And if it wasn't coded up as a table under the hood, further complexities are compounded there, and it becomes a bit of a mess. So remember, an ARIA grid is a compound widget that is a single tab stop. An HTML table, it's just content.
Okay, thank you. Another question about keyboard accessibility. With adding interactive elements in tables, I worry about the impact of keyboard access. I think this was in relation to like sort controls within the table. I feel like it can easily become a hurdle to tab through the table to reach later rows or elements beyond the table.
Yep.
Do you share that concern or other strategies? Is it some of this I may be misinterpreting, but this may be kind of on an assumption that maybe the user actually tabs through the cells within a table when they don't, as long as those cells aren't interactive. So maybe you can address that.
Well, that is an assumption that every cell tabbable is an assumption by some authors. I think this question, though, is more couched in the notion of I showed a table where every row has 3 interactive items. And if you have 50 rows of that, just to get to the next, to pass that table as a keyboard only user is a pain in the bum. And it's a huge concern, and it's a valid concern, and it's something that I've run into regularly. Generally, I recommend a combination of skip links before and after the table. So a keyboard user can skip past the table, and if they're coming up from the bottom of the page, they can skip past the table. Fewer rows and pagination controls so that they can identify the thing I want isn't in here, and it's usually no more than 1 or 2 tab stops away to get to the pagination, as opposed to navigating through 100 rows, 200 rows to try to find the thing they want. Doesn't mean it's ideal. It's always going to be variable based on user, context, experience, technology, and so on.
Okay, wonderful. Next question. I think this was in relation to the scrollable tables, but the question is, isn't it strongly discouraged to build any frames on the page, especially those that require vertical or horizontal scrolling?
So it's not a frame, but I don't think they mean iframe specifically. I think they mean just a content container. And I suspect they're probably referencing reflow, where it was 1.4.10, where you don't want 2 scroll bars of opposing axes on the page. And the short answer to that is it passes that because tables have an exemption. The longer answer is it depends. It comes down to context. If you don't restrict the size of that scrolling area and it takes up the entire viewport, say on a mobile device, and I'm scrolling the table instead of scrolling the page, you've got a problem. That's a usability issue that you would need to address. So often you'll want to look at restricting the width and the height. You might want to only use 90 viewport, viewport height 90, viewport width 90, just as an example, so that it never fills the entire viewport and the user can still at least scroll the page around it. That still can be a usability issue. It can still be a problem, but there are techniques that you can work with your users and the context to try to make it less awful. And I'm keeping that answer brief simply because of the time constraints here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. My office uses AG Grid and UI Grid instead of tables. I'm not familiar with those. I'm presuming they're using some ARIA stuff there for grids. Because of this, caption can't be used to name the grid. I've asked them to provide a header for the grid with an ARIA label of grid appended to the header name. Is there some better method to provide a name for the grids? I don't foresee a change to tables anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that. I have some experience with ARIA Grid. I've filed a number of accessibility bugs, and if you're not a subscriber, then they auto close those after a period of time. They have structures that create lots of challenges, and I'm trying not to blow them up here, but I would never recommend using it. I know you're already using it. I don't use UI Grid. But this means that I don't have a specific technical suggestion here for you. It's going to come down to how is the table set up, what are the features, etc. But in the end, probably naming whatever the container is or having a good header and an ARIA label by referencing that is the simplest way, but I feel that is tragically insufficient for the scenario you're actually encountering in real life. And I just don't know it well enough to give you good guidance.
Yeah, I think that highlights the complexity of grid and just where tables are for tabular data. That's what they're intended for, what they're designed for, and optimally should be used when they can. But we understand there are sometimes constraints to that. Another question. This is going back to the merged cells. Is there a way to use a merged cell within a table and not assign it header status, or is this always problematic for screen readers?
It's always problematic. Even if you don't assign a headers attribute, the browser is still going to convey information to the screen reader, and they're both going to try to do their best. And usually they'll pick whichever is the first header that they span. But if that's a showstopper, don't span. Otherwise, you're going to have to provide some context and hope you have trained users and good instructions.